Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of the Metacell webinar, the first one of 2019. Today, we'll be talking about neuroscience data and the future impact of digital biomarkers and wearables. I'm Stephen Larson. I'm the CEO of Metacell, where we specialize in software for neuroscience. We've done several projects with complex data using wearables and digital biomarkers in our 7-year history, and we're excited to talk more about it today. Today, we've invited Dan Carlin to help walk us through this extremely relevant topic in 2019. Dan Carlin is General Manager at Health Mode, which drives progression to next-generation clinical trials by developing and delivering AI-enabled digital measurement methods for clinical trials. He holds an MD as well as an MA in medical informatics and cognitive science in medicine. A dictionologist and medical informatician working at the intersection of health and technology in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry on novel instrument, data, and analysis-driven strategies for clinical drug development. And in clinical medicine, where he practices psychiatry and addiction medicine, teaches clinical skills and quality improvement, develops novel technologies, and has created a ground-up tech-enabled practice environment. I met Dan on a previous project, and I've seen him speak in the past, and he's really, I think, the perfect person to bring into this audience and help us understand a little bit more about this. So thank you, Dan, for joining us. So the format today, we're going to let Dan kick off with some introductory remarks, basically giving us the 30,000-foot view of what's happening in this space of wearables, what digital biomarkers are, to kind of help give the introduction to that. In the between of this process, we have a few questions that we're going to ask you, the audience, to see a little bit about where you guys are with all of this. And then after Dan's remarks, we're going to go ahead and open it up for a Q&A. I'll be asking Dan some questions that we have for him about how data works in this space, and we'll just basically have a nice dialogue. And in between that, please feel free to go ahead and use the webinar software to put in your own questions. I'll be taking a look at those questions and pulling from those and feeding them into the conversation as well. So we're going to aim for about 50 minutes starting now. Thanks very much for joining us. And with that, let me hand it over to Dan.
Hey, Stephen, thank you so much for the introduction and for having me on here. And thanks, everybody, for joining. Not knowing exactly who's here, I'm sure some of you have heard me say some of this before, but my goal here at the very beginning is to just lay out the way over the past 5 or 6 years that we've started to think about what we do here and to think about the intersection of technology, of measurement, and of illness, and particularly in neuroscience, which has been interesting to me for quite some time, obviously as a psychiatrist, and then as a drug developer for Pfizer, and now as the general manager of Health Mode, like Stephen mentioned, where we really are exclusively focusing on these sorts of measures and thinking about how we can use data to drive forward the science of drug discovery and of clinical care. Some disclosures off the bat. Obviously, we mentioned affiliations, and I think it is important for you to recognize that that I have these conflicts. And I don't just disclose conflicts because I think it's ethically responsible. I think it's also a good way of assessing the information you get in this space. So much of what we do here is driven by commercial interests, and that's okay, but it's important to recognize when information is impacted by commercial interests. So we'll do our best to give you information that is less impacted, but of course we can't completely get away from this. And even by choosing what we choose to talk about, there are biases. So keep those in mind. I think it's a useful way of thinking about the world. I also will be discussing the off-label use of a medication, and that medicine is lithium carbonate, which is, depending on how you measure it, either the most effective medicine in psychiatry or the second most effective medicine in psychiatry. Some people say it's the second most effective treatment in psychiatry after ECT, though it's a moving target. So lithium, starting in the 20s until 1948, lithium was in 7-Up. So we had lithiated lemon lime soda. And you think about the way we think about lithium today, and the idea that this was just in a food product seems unlikely. And until you see this, until you hear it, I didn't know this until fairly recently, it doesn't make a lot of sense. We think of lithium as a difficult to use and dangerous medicine, yet we were giving it to people as essentially as a dietary element. It's also pretty prevalent in the environment, which is something that we've learned over the years. How did lithium ultimately get approved? So from 1948, when it became illegal to just put it in soda, which is probably a good thing, until the 1970s, when we were the 50th country to approve lithium for use as a medicine, 50th country. It was approved based on psychiatrists watching people with bipolar disorder and rating their mania, rating their recovery from mania, rating their continuance of mania, rating their transition into mania. And the truth is, even in our modern drug environment, so there you have lithium that essentially comes from mines. In our modern drug environment, we haven't progressed much past that. So we've, at some level, the argument could be made, particularly in neuroscience, we've run out of low-hanging fruit. We've run out of minerals that save lives. And we've gotten into a place where we're getting to many of even our sort of mechanistic theories of how our current drugs work are turning out to not play out so well. So we've gotten to a place where we're not so sure about mechanism. We've let's say hit the low-hanging fruit. There's the requirement that drugs be safer and safer and more effective. And so what's happened is that costs have skyrocketed, but measures haven't progressed very much. You still look, you've got a doctor, you've got a clinical tech, you've got a CRA looking at a patient and describing them at some level, or you ask patients to describe themselves, and particularly in psychiatric illness and in neuroscience illnesses across the board, self-reflection may be one of the domains that's impaired. So you really run out of ways to objectively measure things, and measures require the presence of folks and the presence of a patient in a particular location. So there we have measures. This is not a blank slide. There are 2 dots on your screen right now. And those represent measurement points. These are completely decontextualized measurement points. They mean absolutely nothing, right? They're data, but they're not meaningful data. If I show you that and tell you that those measures relate to it, suddenly they start to have meaning. And this is probably the most accurate way we have in routine clinical care to measure weight, right? We're just looking at the force of gravity on a body. This is also the highest touch way that we have to measure weight, right? It takes someone standing there and sliding little weights back and forth and ultimately doing an analog to digital conversion in their head, right? The little arrows point at some numbers, someone does some math, and they write down a number. It's an analog device. We convert it digital to digital in our head and we record the numbers. This is a little less effort, but it's still fundamentally an analog device that uses the person as the analog to digital converter. We get a digital number out of it. Its level of precision is probably 1 or 2 digits, and we get a weight. So there we have our weight trend. We know it's a weight. We know those are 2 weights. You can usually assume that this is a time series set of data. So now we know that we decreased weight over time. What's changed? We've moved into a world where everything's connected, right? More and more things that you didn't really realize needed to be connected are ultimately connected to the internet. This is always the example that comes to mind for me. For some reason, still having done this now for as long as there's been an IoT, when I hear IoT, I can't help but think about washers and dryers. And you know, with a washer and dryer in the basement, I don't think I would mind so much if I had one that texted me when it was done. Scales too, right? So here's the next iteration of the scale, and I'm sure folks on the line here have these. I've got one. And what does this do? So it takes the analog signal that is the weight pushing on some springs. It does a measurement that's very similar to the previous scale we saw, and then it does the analog to digital conversion in its head with a little more precision than we do when we look at those numbers, and it beams it up to the internet. It's not that different. But what happens when you've got one of these is that instead of having nice round numbers taken not super frequently, you've got very precise numbers that are likely fairly accurate, probably less accurate than they are precise, that get sent up to the internet and recorded in all their precise glory and with very accurate timestamps. Now what we see is what those data points were extracted from, the real data, weight over time, mostly daily weights, a few days missed here and there. And they're the 2 we picked. Right, we pulled out 2 of these data points because those happened in this example to be the day that someone went into the clinic and got weighed. And we pulled those 2 points out, and it describes a clear trend. But what's obvious is if you're looking at this now that you could have picked 2 different days, a week or 2 apart, where someone went into the office. So someone did this whole thing 2 weeks earlier, and you get a very different trend. If your goal was to demonstrate the effect of a drug on weight, at this point we're in trouble, right? Because the reality of the world differs from what we measured. And fundamentally, what we have the opportunity to do with this commoditization of sensing technology, with everything being tightly linked timescale data, highly granular data, sensors that we carry around with us that we wear, what we have the opportunity to do is change the way we observe in clinical trials and in real life, to start to make our trial data, our real world data, more closely approximate reality.
So Dan?
Yeah.
Yeah. So at this point, actually, when I love this walkthrough, we've talked about digital scales. You've shown some pictures of an Apple Watch and other wearable devices. I think it'd be really great to just ask the group here a poll question. So folks, we're gonna put up a poll here for you. Do you use a digital wearable device to measure anything about yourself? If you guys have that popping up on your screen, wouldn't mind just figuring this out in real time here, and let's see who we've got. Also, as you're answering, just a reminder, you can ask us questions as well about anything during the course of this. So also feel free, once you've answered, to familiarize yourself with the little question box, and feel free to answer, to put questions in for yourself. Now remember, a digital wearable device is pretty broad, so scales or anything can be included in that. All right, we got 79% voted, 81% voted, 86% voted. Yeah, it's just going in real time. We're digitally measuring the audience right now, apparently.
Audience pro, A pro.
That's right. That's right. Okay, got 91% voted. All right, I'm going to close this in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so interesting. We got 63% of folks said they use a digital wearable device to measure something about themselves, and 37% do not. So we're still moving the adoption forward, at least amongst our audience, but point being, it's definitely a majority of folks that are currently doing some of this measurement right now. So I'll hand it back to you, Dan.
Yeah, I guess my question for the people who aren't using it to measure something about themselves is, who is measuring that thing about you? Because I promise somebody's measuring something about you using the sensors in your phone, unless you've got like a Motorola Razr. You're being measured. And so if you're not going and looking at the measures, the dog got bored. If you're not going and looking at, he's heard this a lot. If you're not going and looking at the measures, it's still measuring, I think, is a really critical point here. And so we can get to that later. There may be questions that emerge from that or thoughts on that. Anyway. Yep. So here's the thought, right? Is that we start to move our clinical trial measures to look more like reality, and in a weird turn of phrase, I would say we also move our real world data to look more like reality, right? Real world data has historically mostly meant really highly abstracted and de-identified clinical data, which are also all of the things on the left-hand column here. They're insensitive, they're episodic, they're subjective, they're provider-centered, they're in-clinic, they're unidimensional. So our real world data doesn't really represent reality. And certainly our clinical trials even less so. And the thought is, with all of these connected measurement devices, can we move in the direction of really highly granularly measuring folks in their lives? And there's another representation of it, right, with simpler words: slow to fast, expensive to cheap, subjective, objective, data poor to data rich, researcher-centered to patient-centered. So how does this relate to neuroscience? Everything has to go through Freud, because I'm a psychiatrist and that's where we come from. But what I would offer, and this is somewhat more applicable in psychiatry perhaps than neurology, but that's really because the way we treat the border of psychiatry and neurology is that the problem is psychiatric until we can identify a lesion, right? Or identify a lab test or a signal. And so intractable epilepsy was a psychiatric illness till we identified EEG waveforms, right? Syphilis was a psychiatric illness until we identified, syphilis. And so most things start as psychiatric illness that have an impact on behavior. And then at some point we identify a lesion and we let the neurologist have it, because we like to have hard problems. And so what did Freud do? And the answer really is he looked carefully. And then he did a lot of theorizing, and we've thrown out a lot of his theories because they I don't know, thrown out's the wrong word. We've distanced ourselves from his theories because they seem so certain and they're so unfalsifiable in a sense. And some of them actually have borne out just fine. Some of his theories on how mental illness develops and evolves are very useful. That doesn't mean they're necessarily true, but they're useful. He looked carefully. And so our psychiatric illnesses are fundamentally phenomenologically defined. They're defined by what we can see, how people are, what they do, and to some extent what they describe as their experience. Right? To this day, DSM-5, which was released to much fanfare, didn't represent that much of a departure from this, that illnesses are categorized by their manifestations, by what we can observe and by what someone experiences. And so the issue there, I gave away my punchline, but the issue there is that what we just said is we're not super good at observing, right? That our observations have been hindered by the fact that we make them in clinic, that we make them through the use of professionals who are necessarily somewhat rare, that we're not following people home for the most part, that we're not following them about in their lives and seeing how they engage with their lives and how that relates to these symptoms that we're observing. The argument could be made at this point that psychiatry is unique in this regard. But my argument here, obviously, the one that I gave away, is that it's not, right? Hypertension, which I think for most folks think of this as like a core biological illness and really different from psychiatry, different from psychiatric illness, but of course it's not, right? You can certainly have psychogenic hypertension. Knowing that you have hypertension can make you anxious, right? There's a two-way relationship here, but hypertension is not some biological entity. Hypertension is a symptom or a sign, depending on how you define those two, measured with a device, this device, a sphygmomanometer, that is not that different from the scale I showed you earlier, right? Somebody watches the needle tick down while listening to a sound, and they analog to digital convert in their head when they see the number, sort of the number that they think the sound changed at, right? Let's say you measure blood pressure. You do it a couple of times and you give someone a disease, right? You call it an illness, mainly because we defined numbers as being illness. I don't think hypertension is really any different from a DSM-defined illness. And it's not treated that differently either, right? We symptomatically treat it for the absolute most part. We just reduce the blood pressure. Same way we reduce depression or reduce anxiety. What do these have in common? They have data, right? The fundamental data, that sphygmomanometer reading, which we try to transition into information and ultimately knowledge. And the way that we do that tells us a lot about how medicine works. So at the bottom there, you see the accelerometer that's in your phone and in your watch, right? It's just plates moving across plates. It's an analog device. There's an analog to digital converter. There's some sort of an algorithm, and then it converts it into meaningful information like step count or weight, right? In this case, it's accelerometer to step count, but accelerometry could be converted to a lot of things. That black box that ultimately gives the data meaning can be almost any sort of algorithmic transformation. Ultimately, a bulk of data transforms into less information, transforms into less knowledge. Knowledge has higher density, it has more meaning, but ultimately there may not be information in data, or we may not be able to get the information out of data, and there may not be knowledge and information. So this is like a core informatics principle about these transformations, and it's really important to keep in mind as you think about how data becomes something meaningful.
Okay, so here's actually, I think, another opportunity to ask a question where we can really get at who are the super nerds in our audience. So we're going to ask now, have you ever looked at the data that comes from a digital wearable device you've used? Yes or no? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be hacking around in the guts of your device or pulling something off a chip. You could also just be looking at your Apple Health app, or the equivalent on Android, or maybe even something that's on a website that where data has been uploaded and you've just had a look at it, or maybe even in an email where somebody gave you a summary. But some kind of looking at data that comes from a digital wearable device that you've used. Okay, getting 71% of you have voted. Let's get a few more votes in here.
This is phenomenal engagement. I love it.
Yeah, no, this is great. 80% now. Wow. Okay, those of you who haven't voted yet, I don't know if we're biased by the folks who voted no the first time, who are maybe holding off of this poll, but 80% have voted. I'm going to close it. 3, 2, 1. Okay, and So sharing the results here. I think I read it out last time, but here I'm just showing it. So this is 80% of you voting, where 82% of that 80% are saying that in fact they have looked at the data that has come from a digital wearable device that they've used, and only 18% have not. But maybe the 20% of folks who didn't answer is because they hadn't done much with wearable devices at all. So, but that's still a pretty high fraction of folks. We got a lot of super nerds in the audience, I think, still, what I'm taking away from this.
Weird that that's who would show up to this topic.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. We know our audience. We know our audience. Let's put it that way.
So I think actually something really interesting comes out of that, which is, where do you draw the data information line? You know, if we leave knowledge out to some extent for now, and just say where did data become meaningful information? In this case on the bottom, we call it step count information. And it may be, if the question is, do you know something about how much you stepped in a day, whatever stepping might mean, then that is meaningful information. If the question is, how's your depression, is step count necessarily meaningful information, or is it still data? And I would argue that that shifts the line between data and information, where step count may be meaningful, but I don't think that we necessarily have ever seen that it is and certainly not in all people, right? And so the question you're trying to answer really drives what you call information versus what you call data. Similarly, at the other end of this thing, you know, people like to talk about raw data. I don't know where you draw the line and call something raw data. Is the raw data the analog signal coming off of the plate sliding around? Is the raw data the first level of digitized signal that comes off? Is the raw data some degree of compression around that? If you're thinking about depression and step count, maybe the raw data is steps, or the raw data are steps. You can't really win the is/are with data, can you? So the question there, and this is why I've tried when I've worked with teams to keep away from concepts like raw data, right? Which is just try to describe what it is you want to see, and more importantly, try to connect what it is you want to see with the question you want to answer. So a couple more slides, and then I think we'll be able to start getting into some questions. Ultimately, one of the challenges we have is that when you do something like look at your own step count, you can contextualize that to some extent. So you go, oh, yeah, I walked a lot that day because I had meetings, or I was out in the park and playing with my dog all day. And you can add some context to those data that then give them even more meaning, right? It's the reason I don't measure my step count, because when I look at my step count, all it does is like remind me that I walked a lot a day or didn't walk a lot a day. I already kind of knew that. Whereas with patients, if we gather those data and we don't have contextualizing information, something like step count doesn't necessarily become meaningful information for the sake of a clinical trial. So when we bring people into the clinic and do the Young Mania Rating Scale, like I mentioned at the beginning, that's very contextually controlled, right? So what we do there is we build the context. The context is the clinic sitting across from the doctor on day 20 of the study, whatever. Whereas we let someone roam around with some sort of a sensor, either we have to artificially construct the context out of the data to try to understand what they were intending to do or what they meant to do, or even what they were doing, or we have to find another way of generating context, because most of the time getting toward knowledge from these data requires understanding the data in a context. And I think that's a really critical point that's often lost as we think about wearable data. And how do we do that? So this is sort of the modern analytical technique scale. You look at all these huge sets of data, huge data sets. You use some sort of domain knowledge to figure out what features you might be interested in. You extract those features, and then you use them to model these clinical things that you're interested in. And we can dive back into this in the questions if we want to, but I think this step is a technically complex. These steps are technically complex, and ultimately where a lot of the crux of the ground level work are. Ultimately, the goal here is to understand these aspects of disease, to understand on a very big scale how people feel. But the reason these are in the order they are is because the diagnosis down there at the middle, yes, it has a trajectory, but that trajectory is going to be influenced by other factors. Change with treatment is influenced by even more factors. Activities of daily living, even more factors. Function, right? Function can be influenced by tons of things beyond the diagnosis. And ultimately, how people feel is an incredibly complex, multi-interactive problem. understanding how do you make someone feel better. And a lot of times it has nothing to do with medicine or illness and everything to do with the situations of life. This is another important point when you think about what are the questions we're trying to answer, where does that question sit in this hierarchy?
And just for some of our audiences who may not be up on the lingo, can you just unpack the change in W over TX one? What's that one?
Oh, sure. So the very inside is diagnosis. Trajectory is how we think of the sort of change in a diagnosis over time. Change with treatment, so delta with treatment. So does a medicine help, hurt, or do nothing? Activities of daily living is ADL, FX is function, and then ultimately feel. For those interested in healthcare authorities, FDA and others have signaled very strongly that the things they care about are feels, functions, and survives. So medicines need to help how people feel, help how they function, or change their survival. And more survival alone isn't necessarily going to get you enough. So in complex fatal illnesses like cancer, having a very marginal survival benefit without a real benefit to how someone feels or functions may be not enough to get you drug covered by insurers or even on the market in some places. So I'll quickly walk you through some things we're doing at Health Mode, acknowledging that cough is usually not a neurological illness, though it certainly can be associated with those at times. And so the way we're doing this at Health Mode is we're thinking about things that are currently measured and meaningful in clinical trials and trying to measure them in a more precise, more continuous, less patient impactful way. So in the case of cough, 24-hour cough counts have been a long accepted regulatory endpoint. They're done via specialized devices that have to be worn around, microphones attached to the body, this sort of thing. And all we're doing is we're switching this model to, can we record cough? Can we capture cough from the patient's phone as they use it in their daily life, put it in their pocket, carry it in their purse, whatever. And to do that, you need to have always on recording. You need to have a way to make sure that recording is done in as private a way as possible so that you're not capturing too much conversation, but that you're able to capture cough in a reliable way. And so you can see at the bottom there, coughs just having an auditory amplitude that is higher than background noise. But on the right, you see the confounding of background noise. And so ultimately what we've done in this space is developed machine learning based models that not only enable the reliable detection of cough over background noise, but also allow us to differentiate between people coughing, because of course, if you're interested in a subject coughing who's in your trial, you don't really want to know so much about how much the other folks who work in their office are coughing. It's not, right? That's a confounder, that's not the actual data. And so all of the projects, I don't know what's next, here we go. All of the projects we're working on have this sort of a feel to them. We're doing diet monitoring and stool monitoring and moving toward performance status in oncology and these sorts of things, and trying to do it all with latent continuous data off of the patient's phone. And obviously we're I'm not talking about neuroscience illnesses, though we have some in mind, because neuroscience illnesses have been really difficult to measure. And so what we're doing initially is looking at things where there has been continuous measurement, or it's an episodic phenomenon and there's a reliable way to measure it already that we can just do a little better. But of course, because of my background and the background of folks on the team, what we'd really like to do is to be able to move this in the direction of also measuring psychiatry and neurology. And I think that probably, unless we want to dive into what sort of concepts of validity and things, which if folks online are interested in, we can do, I think that may be a decent place to open up for questions, if you think so too, Stephen.
Yeah, I think so. Great. So just following on this idea of neuroscience, I thought it was really compelling, the idea of these different time points where you might catch a trend in one direction and the opposite trend, just depending on when a person walked in the clinic. When you're talking about a condition like, say, Parkinson's disease, with tremors, I'm curious, especially those where we are still working on trying to get therapeutics in this space. What do you think is the additional potential there for chronic monitoring and the potential to actually help us develop better therapeutics into the future?
Yeah, there are probably three points that come to mind there. One is that even illnesses we think of as being progressive debilitating illnesses that seem to just have a course over time, which is worse and worse, have a much more complicated pattern than that. So Alzheimer's patients have good and bad days. Schizophrenic patients have good and bad days, good and bad hours. Parkinson's patients particularly have good and bad days, but they have good and bad minutes too. And the nature of the medicines that we have to treat them now worsen that phenomenon. And so the idea that, daily weights get you closer to a real understanding of weight is 100% true. Moment-to-moment measurement of Parkinson's gets you closer to understanding where someone is in space. So there are two different ways to slice the data when you think about something like Parkinson's. One is, can you average functionality over a few days so that you understand where someone really is in the course of their illness? And then you do that at multiple time points, or you do it continuously. So you're not just measuring moment-to-moment change, but you're actually measuring a more realistic, a more accurate snapshot of where someone's at in the course of their illness. And then there's also the other way to slice it, which is you say, wait, I'm interested in moment-to-moment change. That's the thing I'm trying to deal with. And then you're capable of measuring moment-to-moment change over the course of days. So it's a very different way of thinking about the same data to get different information. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the drug trial cost slide I showed at the beginning is driven to some extent by the fact that for these sorts of chronic progressive illnesses, you need relatively long studies to be able to have enough of an effect size of your medicine, which is to say, if you're going to modify the course of a progressive illness, right, you need to give the subjects enough time on drug and the subjects off drug enough time off drug to actually have meaningful progression to slow down, right? If someone, in a year, if there's a 0.1% progression, which is low, right? And you make a 50% difference, that's still not going to reveal itself very strongly across a number of subjects. And so the idea that you can have much more precise and accurate measurement in a trial means that you can use shorter trials, less observation time, and detect meaningful change that may have been washed out anyway. And then the last one is that particularly for folks with like a movement disorder, like Parkinson's disorder, the very act of getting to the clinic is a hardship, right? So if you have to go somewhere to be measured, just being able to measure continuously at home means we're not asking more of our patients or our subjects in this case than benefits them. And you get that sort of high granularity measurement without the subject having to do much more than they would ordinarily do. And when someone goes into a clinic, you're not necessarily seeing how they usually are. So like I mentioned in the hypertension example, the very act of being in the clinic modifies the measurement. So there's just a change from the measurement.
That's excellent. So for folks here in the audience, we're starting to get some questions coming in. So thank you. Keep them coming here. I'm going to start pulling from that list shortly. But before I go into some of those questions, just to follow up as well, what's the space looking like right now for actually combining a wearable device with an intervention? So again, in the example of Parkinson's, there are now deep brain stimulators that can be chronically implanted. Where do you think is the space for the combining of stimulation with detection in real time, possibly?
Yeah, we haven't done a ton. So there are a few medicines that are dosed acutely and precisely. And insulin is one that obviously folks are very familiar with, that needs to be dosed acutely and precisely. And there is some work in the biohacking world, and certainly moving toward manufacturing and use by the general public who aren't willing to biohack their insulin pumps, toward real-time measurement and actuation of insulin doses, right? In some cases, we're seeing these things come to market and get tighter glucose control, more like a real pancreas. In neuroscience, we have seen the first kind of novel modern digital drug approval on something called the Abilify MySite. Otsuka, who owns Abilify, and a company called Proteus, put together a package of a patch that's worn on the skin over the stomach, and an embedded chip in the Abilify pill that, when swallowed, sends a signal to the patch, and essentially then sends that signal to the user's phone to say that they ingested the medicine. One thing worth noting about Abilify MySite is that despite about a 3-year development paradigm, they weren't able to get any additional label claims based on that. So usually when you go through all this sort of effort to drive something through another study that you already have an approval of, the goal is new label claims. And in this case, there aren't any. In fact, it came with a warning that it may not accurately detect ingestion, so don't rely on it in emergencies. In Parkinson's, I think you're onto something, and this is something I've told everyone who's working on continuous measurement in Parkinson's, is get with the DBS, the deep brain stimulation companies, and figure out a way to titrate DBS using these measures. There's nothing happening in that space that I'm aware of right now, but that doesn't mean that Medtronic and the other folks who have DBS machines aren't thinking about it.
So that's an interesting frontier. Okay, some questions from you folks here. We had a couple questions related to error and bias, so I'm just going to take them together. So one is wearable devices are dependent on self-recording or reporting. So how do we measure error rate? And the other is, what types of bias do you see most often, and how do you alter the data based on those biases?
Right. So when we ask people questions, when we say fill out a, what we would traditionally call eCOA or ePro, and COA reflects that entire world. So the Young Mania Rating Scale implemented on a device for the physician is a form of clinical outcome assessment. Patient reported outcomes, ePro is another form of eCOA. And so yeah, there's absolutely self-reporting introduces bias. It introduces recall bias. Among others, right? And we've known that for a really long time. I'm not sure e-reporting is less biased than paper reporting. At least with e-reporting, you know exactly when someone reported. You don't know that they're accurately reporting their current state, but you know if they're reporting about last Wednesday today. And so you have more knowledge. What we do with that knowledge, we're not super clear on yet. We haven't really decided how you treat data that's retrospective, that's supposed to be concurrent. But there's no question there are biases related to expectation, related to pleasing investigators. I mean, as many as you can think of. But I worry when we start to say, well, self-report is biased, therefore it's concerning, because the answer is yes, but it always has been. And so let's not, in these situations, necessarily hold our modern technology to a too much of a higher standard than we hold paper, right? One of the concerns, oh, well, who's filling out the ePro? Well, we didn't know that on paper either, right? And so we kind of let that go. And so we can make efforts to know, but I'm not sure we should hold up these efforts based on those concerns. The second question is, I think, around systematic bias and measurement in more sensor-based measurements. And that's a great question. In general, you would think sensor-based measurement ought to be less systematically biased in its measurement alone. But then you start to go back, okay, well, what patients are we're doing a bring your own device trial that requires a newish iPhone and the operating system needs to be updated and stuff. And then you start to worry, okay, maybe we're introducing systematic bias in how we recruit or track enroll subjects. And so yeah, all of these things are absolutely potential biases. The one thing that I don't necessarily worry about as much is once you've got the stupid watch or device or phone on someone, systematic bias in that measurement, that ought to be accounted for in your validation work and in your understanding of what you're trying to measure. So I hope I answered that question. If there was more that you were sort of looking for, feel free to drop another one in there and we can try to get to it.
Sounds good. And as we're transitioning more into this QA section here for the last 15 minutes, are you okay if we take down the screen share?
Yeah,
do you have more stuff on there?
Okay. Do you want to do that, or should I?
Yeah, I'll take care of it. But let me kick off with the next question then. So we had a question about a particular kind of wearable device. Since over 50% of the population are female and most women have a menstrual cycle, why don't we yet have better wearables for things like ovulation? The science would be very simple, and there are robust biological, behavioral markers of it, like sleep. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, sleep, temperature, right? I mean, there's some really wonderful opportunities there. Sexism, probably, honestly, like is probably a perfectly reasonable answer for why you might see less work on this. Historically, we've tended to regard things in the OBGYN space as a little less technologically targetable, just I think mainly because of history. So, if this is something you're interested in, there may be devices and people who want to work on this. I think this would be a wonderful thing to get into. And if whoever asked that question wants to chat about what we do, and one of the things we had been talking about is reproductive health in general. and how we might be able to think about reproductive health from a wearable perspective. So we're right with you, we're right on board. There's some other opportunities in drug development. I was talking with a company that we probably can't say the name of, that's very involved with a certain class of drugs that may have, that was not, they never got an FDA label for menstrual cramps, but may be really helpful with menstrual cramps, again, probably because of sexism. And so I, trying to promote the opportunity to maybe move that drug in that direction. So certainly we're welcome to, we welcome that conversation. We're eager to find areas where folks aren't working for reasons that are not good scientific reasons, but just not working because they're not working, and try to work there.
There you go. I think we've identified a gap. There's a potential innovation opportunity right there.
That said, the landscape of folks working on this is such a rapidly moving picture that there might be 20 ovulation timing startups out there that I just have never heard of and don't know about. So
yeah, cool. So now kind of a metacell question for you. So when you were talking about the conversion of data into knowledge, we've in the past worked with several groups that are particularly interested in not just data coming from one wearable, but from a collection of wearables, and bringing them all together, aligning them in time. There's various challenges when what you're trying to do is assemble a big picture. You've mentioned some examples with cough and deep learning, but how do things get more complicated as you try to add more measurement modalities to the picture, and what are the things that you think are working well in that space?
Yeah, that when I talk about artificial context generation, I think the main way we're going to be able to do that is through integration of different sensor streams. And so it's absolutely critical that we're able to integrate sensor streams across different sensing modalities. It is more challenging than people imagine to be, and you know that as well as anybody else, that even something as simple as timestamps, right? Time ought to be time. Like we all have sort of agreed on some standards for time and when now is. But as soon as you have devices that aren't talking to each other, even devices that are talking to each other, and that talking takes time, alignment and time can become incredibly difficult to navigate and manage. And if you're talking about something precise like left arm swing as it relates to right foot swing, a little bit of time difference and non-alignment might wash out any disease-related changes that you were hoping to see. So time, I think, is difficult. Data storage is not difficult because these data are large, though they are large, and not difficult because storage is expensive, because it's not particularly anymore. More difficult just because time series data and time series databases are not what a lot of us are used to working. We're used to sort of SQL structures and things like that aren't totally well oriented toward highly granular time series data, where the data aren't very thick, but they're quite long. And so the challenge there is quite real. And then just making sense of it all, right? How do you relate disparate data streams? And ultimately that falls back on domain-specific knowledge, but we may not have enough domain-specific knowledge in the right sort of domain-specific knowledge to connect across sensing modalities in a way that necessarily makes sense. So then you're left with sort of an unstructured search. How do we make sense of the fact that these things seem coincident? And then you end up with correlations, right? Then you get back to sort of the initial round one of all this was, strap a device on everybody, let everybody walk around recording all the time, and sense will emerge. And that is not how it's happened, right? We, prior to my arrival at Pfizer, there were a lot of studies that included, devices that included accelerometers, and those accelerometry data were abstracted to actigraphy data, and those actigraphy data were analyzed alongside the clinical data, and then they were thrown away because nothing emerged. And so, myriad challenges, but I think the opportunity that's emerging is really multimodal. It's going to have to be multimodal sensor streams. And I would go back to the work we did at Pfizer and Blue Sky that you worked on also, and say I think that was it done carefully and about as well as anyone had done it, which is, can we get as many sensor streams as we can? Can we overlay them in a reasonable way? Can we annotate them in a reasonable way? And then can we try to train models on them? And so I think that work has been done fairly well. There are a number of papers that are in process or even in press right now on that effort.
That's I think covering quite a lot of the space here. And so dovetailing on this, and especially for folks that are looking at the question of where this is happening in terms of big industry or small industry, as well as where things are closed and where are open. There's a question that comes with this. Question is, how committed are you to the biomedical knowledge system that uses continuous measurement to create large aggregated data sets that then deliver generally applicable therapies through the healthcare industry? And then it says, which is obviously dominated by big pharma, assumption. Do you have any interest in contributing tools and knowledge to the open science system so that individuals and their caregivers can make use of it? Also some interesting assumptions in that too, but let's just unpack that one.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm the first to say, I'm probably not the first to say, I'm happy to say that I'm not sure the corporate structures we've created to solve many of the illnesses we're trying to solve are the right ones. I'm not sure capitalism has it in it to solve Alzheimer's. And, it may need to be outside of the corporate structures. Similarly, I don't think measurement, and I don't know an example of a measurement that evolved in a walled garden and was proprietary and ultimately became particularly meaningful in medicine. I'm sure there are a couple you can think of, but our most meaningful measurements are ones that were used a lot. And I'll go back to the blood pressure example. Blood pressure, when we first came up with, well, a few hundred years of the concept that there might be pressure in there, 100 years or so of trying to measure it. And Eisenhower on, we started to think maybe if it's too high, it's bad. How did we come to blood pressure being in that moderate range where it's not instantly killing you, it's not causing your organs to blow out, but it's doing damage slowly over time? How did we figure that out? We figured it out through a lot of people measuring blood pressure in the same way, reporting those numbers and watching what happened to people and looking back at their old numbers. If you couldn't have a lot of people recording blood pressure in a same enough way, then we wouldn't know what we know today about the need to control hypertension. That only came from prospective validation. And you only really get prospective validation when you can measure a lot of people and see what happens to them. Even with all that in blood pressure, the numbers change every few years because we learn more. And we learn that even what we used to think of as being, okay, well, that's marginally high and we don't need to control that. We learned that that actually predicts bad outcomes. So then we control it. But then even more recently, we learned, well, if we only look at in-clinic blood pressure, then we think some people have hypertension and we put them on a drug and give them all the burden of being on a drug, including health burden of being on a drug, when they don't actually have this thing called hypertension, because if you let them check their blood pressure at home, it's not actually high, right? So the continuous evaluation and reevaluation of a measure is what makes it meaningful. And I think that can only come from as open as possible exposure for these measures. So yeah, I'm committed to that concept. I'm committed to sharing data sets where it's possible. I'm committed to thinking about that from the outset when we set up studies and consent people for studies, to making sure that we're getting consent to share as much of their data as folks are willing to share. Generally, we haven't asked this because we thought subjects wouldn't like it, and IRBs were protecting subjects from this sort of sharing. Turns out, especially in sick people, if you ask if you can share data, people are like, wait, you weren't going to share it? Why wouldn't you share this? Because they want solutions, they want cures. And so where possible, yeah, me as an individual and Health Mode as a company, we're very into the idea of sharing. We're very into the idea of open sourcing, or at least open blueprinting, so other folks can measure things in a similar or the same way, and that those data sets can be integrated. How this all intersects with big pharma and how much big pharma controls the world of early discovery and development right now, those are open questions. There are certainly pharma companies who have been talking the talk about sharing, and certainly pharma companies are eager to use things that other people share. But I think we have somewhat of a reckoning coming in the measurement space, where proprietary algorithms measuring things for the last 20 years, measuring things that were measured continuously off of devices and then run through proprietary algorithms, I don't think it's gotten us very far. And so I think that there's a general recognition in the field that exactly, I don't know exactly what you're saying, but close enough to what you're asking about, needs to start to happen. Citizen science is, I think, not necessarily, it's an orthogonal or a tangential question, which is who should be using these things. I think our research ecosystem has good protections in place against misuse of data. So I continue to encourage folks to get IRB approval if they're doing research, human subjects research or research on human subjects data, and to make sure that we have ethical frameworks in place to protect people, their privacy, the use of their data, and to ultimately, a lot of science done by big science, as it were, is right at the time and ends up being wrong. A lot of it's wrong at the time and ends up being wrong. Some things are accidentally right. You know, the science is imperfect as it exists today. Continuous measurement will help clinical science, but the recognition that there are processes and procedures that lead to the best chance of success is universal, and it doesn't matter what entity you represent, whether it's yourself or a big company. Those principles ought to be adhered to as closely as possible. That was a wide-ranging answer, but someone wants to shoot me an email and chat more about this, happy to.
No, I think that was necessary. I think the space requires a balanced approach to it, and ourselves, we've done a lot of work on the open space, and we think there's a lot of amazing open tools, and we also do some work that in the closed space, and so we also see, you know, the advantages of both, but also some of the blockers. So I think I really agree with everything you said there. Okay, so we're coming up to the end of the webinar. If you're still here, thank you so much. Actually, almost all of you still are. We only have time for one more question. So there's a few questions that we're not going to get a chance to get to, but let me just kick that one off, and then we'll let everybody go on their day. So we've got someone who is a sleep specialist in Seattle. I think I saw that movie. And they ask, can you comment about wearables measuring sleep? The accuracy of the measurement is quite questionable, assumption, especially when measuring people with sleep disorders.
Yeah. So the leading edge of wearables has always been things that were already measured continuously, because then you put a continuous measurement on and you have a nice way of developing criterion validity. So sleep has always been the sort of leading edge. In some cases, it seems to do a decent job of approximating what we might know via PSG without the burden of PSG and the impact of PSG on the thing it's measuring itself. In other cases, I think you're right, particularly in disorders, we just, you know, if the sleep itself is disordered, then what we thought we knew about the relationship between something like PSG and accelerometry-based measure falls apart to some extent. So I'm this, we didn't mention this in the outset, but I'm the CMO of a company that works on detecting and eliminating nightmares using a wearable. And so super interested in this. Sleep specialist in Seattle, if you want to get in touch, feel free to. And then I think as we round this out, probably goes for everybody. I'm very easy to find on the internet. Shoot me an email, and happy to take any of these further or discuss things further or look for opportunities to collaborate, because open data, open science, open algorithms or not, collaboration is clearly the way forward in this space.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much, Dan, for joining us. I think this has been a really enjoyable hour. Thanks all to you for joining us here. We will be continuing to do these webinars on relevant topics in this space in the rest of the year. So please watch your email and stay tuned for the next one. Thanks very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Stephen.
Yep. Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.